Hi, my name is Liz Fair, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the South Dakota Humanities Council, which produces the annual Festival of Books, and we're so pleased to have you here today to join us for this exciting presentation. First and foremost, we'd like to acknowledge that this program comes to you from the homeland of the Oceti, Shakowin, the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota people. The South Dakota Humanities Council honors and appreciates the Indigenous people who have the longest relationship with the place and land. Before our event gets underway, just a few housekeeping details. One is that we'd like you to keep your microphones muted during the presentations. If you have questions, which we would love, please type them into the chat if you're on Zoom or into the comments section if you're on Facebook. Also, amazingly, I found our Festival of Books is free, and we'd love to keep it free so that everyone can attend. So if you can, please go to southdakotahumanities.org, and there's a little donate button that you can push. And it's very easy to do. I've done it before, and donate if you can. We'd also like to thank our donors, organizations, and companies who donated to our festival to keep it free. And here's the cover of the beautiful guide. Today, we have two presenters who are going to be presenting, turning an Illustrator into an illustrated book. And I brought a couple pictures to show, and I know you'll see them probably again from the presenters, but I just wanted to share. Jeanne Bowman, this is her illustrated work. It's The Selfish Giant by Oscar Wilde, who just happens to be one of my favorite authors, and it's a short story. And you can see her beautiful illustration. The second one was actually written by Emily Crawford Wilson, who's our other presenter. And it's called Charlie Russell and the Gnomes of Bullhead Lodge. And Emily wrote the book, and Jeanne illustrated the book. And again, you can see the beautiful illustrations, which they're going to talk about more during the program. So just a little bit more about Jeanne and Emily before we turn it over to them. Jeanne has her art degree from the Rocky Mountain College. She primarily works in watercolors, but she's also branched out to cut paper, digital, and cyanotype art. And Jeanne, I had to look up cyanotype art because I didn't know what it was. What it looked like blueprints. And so I'm hoping that you'll be able to explain more of that if we have time at the end. I'd really like to learn more about that, unless there's lots of other questions. Her artwork has been exhibited at galleries, libraries, and cultural centers in Montana, New Mexico, among others. Emily Crawford Wilson is a curator of art at the Briscoe Western Art Museum in San Antonio, Texas. She holds her master's degree in art from Indiana University, and she has curated exhibitions and contributed essays to catalogs on the art of the American West. She lives in Texas with her daughter, and they love to be outside and go to national parks, which is near and dear to my heart as well. So all that being said, I'd like to welcome Jeanne and Emily and have a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
I'm delighted to be here tonight to speak with you about the life and art of Western artist Charles Marion Russell and introduce some of the material related to Russell's time spent in Glacier National Park, his illustrative work and storytelling that inspired my children's book. I'll just have a presentation. Okay, born in St. Louis, Missouri in 1864, the rest of Russell's childhood was filled with early stories, legends, and myths of the frontier experience. St. Louis was still the most important point of trade and entry into the Western territories, where mountain men, trappers, and fur traders still frequented the river and the streets of the city. As a young child, Russell's father read adventure novels to him and recounted tales of his great uncles, Charles and William Bent, who were prominent traders and helped open the Santa Fe Trail in 1829, establishing Bent's Fort, a major trading post. These fictive and historic tales of adventure stirred up his imagination and made him determined to embark on his own adventure in the West. So at the age of 16, he went out to Montana Territory in 1880 and fulfilled his desire to live out west. While living on the range, Russell survived his first few years in Montana, taking odd jobs as a sheep herder, night wrangler, and trapper, where he gained practical experience and learned to navigate the landscape. He was also compelled to create art and worked whenever possible, painting on stray bits of paper, on old wooden boxes, even on boards kindly planed for him by a friendly carpenter, using tools that he carried around in an old sack warmly referred to as his war bag. The young artist's remarkable memory for detail helped him retain the regional color and character told in tales around the campfire by old timers and those who had worked on the open range. You can see a few of his early oils here, and Russell himself dressed as a cowboy. Russell's image of the West and language and the art it gave rise to was developed in these formative years, stretching from 1880 to 1893. So his subject matter was cowboys, natives, wildlife, and the swiftly changing American West that defined his career and his reputation, not only as a great artist, but as a great storyteller. Even in the company of contemporary heavyweights, Irvin Cobb and Will Rogers, Russell stood out as a storyteller and performer. Writer Edward Cave described the artist's effect in person, quote, "He has the true old-time plainsman and trapper's gift at spinning yarns, and his equal as an original campfire raconteur will rarely be heard. He is decidedly human, with a very keen sense of humor and daring imagination, is naturally droll, has a perfect control of his remarkably striking features, has a pleasingly mellow bass voice, excellent power of description, and tells a story as a gambler plays poker," unquote. And Will Rogers, who was a personal friend, wrote, "With old Charlie, if he had quit talking to you and started painting, you would have got sore. It wasn't what you wanted. What you wanted was to hear him talk or read what he said, while he could think twice as straight as he could draw a line with a brush. He was a philosopher, a great humorist. He had an underlying spiritual feeling. In people, he loved human nature. In stories, he loved human interest. He was a real downright honest-to-God human being." And so it's this ineffable quality about Russell, his magnetic spellbinding ability to tell a good story, that encouraged me to write a children's book. And I wanted to honor that quality in him and introduce him to younger generations. With artists who have made it into the fine arts canon, there really is no question on their ability to paint and convey meaning through the visual arts. But to have copious testimonies from their contemporaries as to the goodness of their characters, the strength of their friendship, their ability to invoke humor and whimsy into people's lives, that is rare indeed, but comes up repeatedly with Russell. And it is the myth of the man that attracts so many people to Russell's art and life. And it's in this tradition of pulling out those human qualities that I'm working in. So after the great Frederick Remington's death in 1909, Russell became the go-to Western painter in the commercial art market, picking up key commissions such as illustration for Owen Wister's 1911 edition of the Virginian and assignments from major magazines, including Harper's, McClure's, and Outing. The same year also saw the opening of his first major one-man show at Folsom Gallery in New York City, aptly titled "The West That Has Passed," which showcased works highlighting his own nostalgia for the mythic West. You can see here in this narrative painting, Russell's striking visual expression to the many historic dramas that built the region's reputation as one centered on opportunism, ruggedness, and independence. Not only did Russell create illustrations for other authors' books, but he wrote his own poems and short stories too, the first of which appeared in the Great Falls Tribune in 1906. More appeared in Outing magazine, and from 1916 through 1921, he published 20 stories in the special syndicate set out by the Montana Newspaper Association. His wife, Nancy, was the impetus ushering him to publish and write, which was a laborious task for the artist who preferred to paint. But somehow she managed to have him publish 3 stories from the Tales on the Range: Rawhide Rollins in 1921, More Rawhides in 1925, and Trails Plowed Under, which was published in 1927, shortly after his death. And to add to this, his widow also did a collection of his illustrative letters, which were in 1929 titled Good Medicine. And the historical focus of his stories ranged from the 1820s to the 1920s and detail the change that he witnessed during his lifetime in the American West. His casual writing style grew directly from his oral storytelling delivery. Russell's writing was filled with the colloquial slang of rural people and informal communication. His stories offer us perspectives on the American West that dealt with changing technologies, racial discord, gender differences, wilderness degradation, and economic stress. And ultimately, he told aloud many more stories than were ever captured. So I encourage you to pick up some of those books at your local library or online if you get a chance, because they're pretty great to read. And so when I worked at the C.M. Russell Museum in Great Falls, Montana as their senior curator, what struck me most was viewing the Josephine Trigg collection of art that was the museum's foundational collection. These were works that were acquired by his friends and neighbors over the course of a 35-year friendship with the artist. They were personal, intimate, and displayed a lot more diversity in subject matter and interest than the art he produced for the commercial market. Much of it was influenced by the books he read, the places he visited, and of course by his own imagination. You can see here a picture of his neighbor, Josephine Trigg, who's in the middle of a hammock. Russell's wife, Nancy, is on the right, and Russell himself standing to the left. And just for example, these three I pulled up, this sort of a nymph character, Friar Tuck, and this great Arabian scene that was likely inspired from Russell's trip to the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. And like I said, he was an avid book reader. Josephine Trigg was a local children's librarian. So they would often give books to each other as gift giving, and he would do extra illustrations of the page. He even gifted two beautiful works on paper to the Great Falls Public Library for their children's department, one of Santa Claus and another of the Three Wise Men, I think another of just storytelling, a native and his son. So Russell really had this wonderful tradition of creating like a friendship and art creation, which I think is really key to these understanding these gnomes. And this is where they come from. So none of the gnomes look alike, and they were all made with distinct personalities and charm. The ones that were survived were saved from his cabin at Bullhedge Lodge, were part of his studio collection, or were given to him to gifts as children that were then donated back to the museum and other collections. And you can see some here. They're quite delicate, having been crafted by hand from bark, moss, mushrooms, twigs, beads, paint, string, cork, and other manners of odds and ends from the forests of Glacier National Park and Russell's studio in Great Falls. Here are a few that are survived, and what's really great when I'm pulling together this book, part fantasy, part historical truth, was to be able to mine through the museum's collection of photographs that Russell took, his wife took, and friends took that they collected, and then were gifted back or bought by the museum. And so you can see these two great historic photographs here of sort of little gnomes that were placed on the trail path. And then Russell and his friend, Philip Goodwin, who was a fellow artist who visited him, looking down on a few in their gazebo studio. To me, when I look at these gnomes, they seem as if they're charged to life by the artist's imagination, art at last personified. These creatures of the landscape became the outward faces of Bullhead Lodge, placed on guarding the cabin, sprinkled on paths throughout the property. They reflect both the humanity and the natural world as it simultaneously coexisted within Russell's own art. The artist first visited Glacier National Park region around 1904, actually 6 years before it was designated a national park, and was instantly inspired by the rich landscape and wildlife of the area. He quickly purchased a tract of land on the south side of Lake McDonald and built a cabin in 1906, Christian Bullhead Lodge, after his famous bison skull signature. And the cabin functioned as both a summer retreat and an entree into the natural world. You can see here some great photographs of the early years, and even how he built the porch. He was adamant he didn't want to chop down the trees, so they built this great porch around the trees. An avid outdoorsman, Russell escaped almost every summer to his cabin and studio in the mountains, where he often hiked, sketched, and painted en plein air, studying the wealth of wildlife around him. As he expressed in a letter in 1919, quote, "Now the prairie's been civilized out of all knowing. Up in the mountains, it's different. Things are still pretty wild. Of course, there's no buffalo now. There was in my time, and there wasn't much else, just nature," unquote. So you can see here a photograph of him with Philip Goodwin. They often also pose and take photographs of each other, but hiking was a great pastime. At the bottom corner is one of the illustrated letters that Russell wrote, the only one in which he actually included the gnome figures. Here he's chastising them for sleeping on the job while the skunks, rats, and everything else sort of get into his cabin and wreak havoc. And then a little bit more of Russell's humor, you can see on the right in an illustrated letter, him sort of hanging on and climbing a glacier, hanging on to dear life, which is pretty funny. And here are some just beautiful sketches here of Russell's time painting en plein air in the area, just getting these beautiful color studies. And I want to read to you Russell's nephew's description of Bullhead Lodge, because it's a beautiful and poetic reminder of the powerful impact that a physical place can have on the psyche. He described it thus, quote, "Approaching through the timber, you would see the glowing open, all amber and gold, and up the slope and watching you, mysterious looking the cabin, dark and secretive under its eaves. The brighter the day, the darker the eyes, which is to say the windows. It may be as bare as a barn inside. It always seemed to hide secrets," unquote. And so for Austin Russell, and perhaps in the minds and memories of many visitors, Bullhead Lodge projected this warm aura of mystery and possibility, a place where the imagination could take root and be carried away in the creation of art, storytelling, and performance, drawing inspiration from the primitive and the sublime in nature. A few of these photographs here are ones that I took myself when I got to visit. I don't know, I've heard rumors that the cabin may have been acquired by the C.M. Russell Museum, but I'm not quite sure. However, it is quite magical if you do get a chance to visit it in person. Some other great whimsical figures of the gnomes. And again, another illustrated letter, and this is an example of this birch bark poem that he wrote specifically for two of his friends that got engaged and went up to his place in Bullhead Lodge for their engagement sort of celebration that he gave to them. Russell actively created his environmental aesthetic. He made bear tracks using the heel and ball of his hand and tip of his fingers in wet cement that caught the rain off of the cabin's eaves, as well as incised decorations carved into wet cement of the fireplace mantle. And he would also create these privacy screens that artists would create, and see these little model sculptures. He placed them in landscape, take photographs, and then create painting compositions. These photographs here reveal a side of revelry and role-playing that was key form of leisure, social bonding, and an outlet for Russell's Lodge visitors, just so you can see how they keep themselves entertained here. And so key, I think, to creating a good children's book is to understand that your book will be the catalyst for a performance between the speaker and the listener, and in many cases, the adult and the child. The human voice is thus employed as an art form through articulation and the performance of storytelling. In cultural critic Roland Barthes's discussion of the pleasure of the text, he writes, quote, "I am interested in language because it wounds or seduces me," unquote. So when I was thinking about how this book should sound, I wanted the prose to have a lyrical quality, to use words and employ sounds that would have a stimulating presence when read aloud to young readers. So in the example above, you can see that when I'm referring to the talk of gnomes, crackling twigs, gravel rocks underfoot, roots tugged up through the ground, earthy sounds. So really trying to give this full dimensional sense through using language to sort of create this atmosphere and engage more than one sense. And at the bottom, really interested again in the lyricality of words and also introducing new vocabulary to young readers. So, and I'm talking about color, so I'm trying to make it interesting. So when I say, quote, "First lake water blues, then daubs of forest green, shades of budding autumn red and orange leaves, deep browns made of patches of bark and tree trunk and gritty gray pebbles set down the shoreline. And then background was washed in short strokes and dips to form the angles and slopes of mountains and purples, whites, and blues. Just kind of having a nice flow and invoking a lot of picturesque imagery to go along with Jeannie's beautiful illustrations. So here's just some reference material for Lake McDonald. And just to say again, I was merging the historic. So these great photographs, so Russell did paint on the patio of Lake McDonald here. You can see him, many of his friends visited. He finished many in his studio back home, but it was again a place of respite, and many of his Glacier Park paintings, like you can see here, were created thus. And one of the main characters in the stories is a guy named Jody Young, who was Russell's only protege. Now, I reference sign language in the book that Joe is signing to Russell, and that's because Jody Young was deaf. He contracted, I think, meningitis as a young child, and then he got dizzy, and it took him 6 months to relearn how to walk, and he could ride better, but he couldn't be a stuntman for the movie, so instead he chose to be an artist, and he started writing and corresponding with Russell, and Russell brought him up, and he kind of just never left Montana until Russell did, and then he went to California, worked for the movies, John Ford, Cecil DeMille. He was often a guy who would do drawings for their Westerns, costumes for them, scenery, and also be just a source for them. And so a little bit of fabrication. So for example, Jody Young only started coming up to Glacier in 1913, way after this painting here was painted. The end of the Kootenai was 1906, but you can see I'm kind of trying to weave this whole together. And again, this image here, that's actually in the collection of National Cowboy, Joe signing to the little people in Native mythology, the Nappy figures. And for me, this is sort of one of the key drawings that really brings to life that he really is merging his imagination with the art and creating as if they are having this mystery together in real life and through art. So I just think this is such a fun drawing to have Joe signing to these people. And again, with the whole introduction of the Kootenai and having the gnomes come up with using a canoe for the painting, I really wanted to invoke how important the Native people were to Russell and how important he took their spirituality beliefs and just was very interested in learning as much as he could and incorporated them into a lot of his artwork. So just from his own writing and the years spent around the campfire listening to the stories of old timers, Russell understood that when it came to telling a good story, one ought not stay too close to the truth. As he once advised, quote, "You like straight goods, but the world don't, and they are the folks that buy books," unquote. So with that advice, I did the best I could, blending fantasy with history in order to create a story that brought some art to life and inspired children to find their own magic within the natural world. Thank you.
That was awesome, Emily. I really wish I had some of those references that you had while I was making the book. I'm like, oh, I could have used that for this painting or that painting. They're pretty awesome. So let me share my screen here. Okay, so let me move this out of my way so I can see what I'm doing. Can we squash? I'll push it over here. Okay, all right. So this is my second illustrated picture book, and this one was a definite departure from what I'm used to. I kind of consider myself a fantasy artist. I grew up really loving and reading. I basically devoured books like they were going out of style, of fairy tales and folk tales and anything with a dragon in it, you know, that sort of world. But I never really had a great appreciation for Western art or Charlie Russell until this book. I remember I've grown up in Eastern Montana for most of my life, but I didn't really hear about Charlie Russell until I took an art history class, and we touched on him briefly. But this book brought his full personality to light and kind of got me excited about Western art. And it was a definite push out of my comfort zone to make a story that wasn't just fantasy. I mean, this is about real people and a real place. And it was a wonderful challenge to try and depict things that still had that magical quality, but you know, told the story in a way that was honoring Charlie and all the people in his life at the same time. So I'm going to tell you, I don't really know all the facts about Charlie the way Emily does. So I'm going to tell you about how I illustrated the book, the process of it, the inspirations and the references behind it. Some of the stuff she covered, you might see again here, but let's see how we get going. So when I first started this story, and the last book I illustrated as well, the very first step is to get acquainted with the characters, because it takes about a year for me to illustrate a picture book. And this one, I think it was about a year, give or take a little bit of time. I knew I would have to be in their heads. I knew I would have to draw them from different angles, understand their mannerisms. So the very first step was to gather a whole bunch of different references of them at different angles, and then draw directly straight from those photos and try to recreate them as closely as I could in my sketchbook. And then from there, it was a matter of simplifying them, getting playful with them, having a lot of fun, trying to figure out, okay, so what is the shape of Charlie's face? Is it still Charlie if I change this little, if I make his ears bigger, if I make his nose bigger, if I make his eyes smaller, does it still look like Charlie? Until I found a combination that seemed to work for the story, but still kept the likeness. And I looked at a bunch of different images, including his self-portraits and even cartoons of him. I did the same for Joe. I really love this postcard drawing that he had done. The legs, this sort of splayed leg pose. And then when it came to the gnomes, though, I had a little bit of a misunderstanding. I'm not sure why I had this idea. I can't remember now, it's been too long, but I thought that I was supposed to come up with gnomes sort of inspired by Charlie's gnomes. So I made these three. But then when I was corrected, I went, oh, whoops. So I'm going to go back to the drawing board. So I made these three. And as you can see, I tried to use a reference from Charlie's gnomes as close as I could. Here's a couple examples of the costume designs that I found, especially for the warrior. He stumped me for a while because I couldn't tell what he, where his clothing came from. And I had to flip through a bunch of costuming books until I found this group, which looked similar to what he wears. These are just some more of the gnomes. These ones I copied pretty much exactly from the image. I did add a feather and some jewelry here, and I did try and give them a sort of a menacing expression in this page. The other step after discovering the characters was to find inspiration and to do research. So I read these three books. I especially enjoyed People Before the Park, which is about the Kootenai and Blackfeet people and their life in and around the park, and how it's been affected since settlers came and settled the land. I also wanted to utilize the People Center, which is now called the Three Chiefs Culture Center in Pablo, Montana, but unfortunately COVID stopped me. But I think it's a great resource because it's made by the Confederated Tribes for the people. If you're interested in it, you can always go to thepeoplecenter.org. In addition to that, I was looking at Charlie's paintings. I was trying to study the way he used color, the way he composed his images, the way he told stories by posing the characters in his paintings, the brush strokes. I especially love this one because I love this zigzag composition here that just takes you back and forth, not to mention the complementary color palette with this kind of orangey brown color and this blue color here. I thought that was awesome. These are some more of his paintings that I looked at. This one with the deer, I used kind of as direct inspiration for the copyright / dedication page for the book. And something that I really got excited about once I read about it was the fact that Charlie and I are related. And I don't mean as humans. I'm not in any way related to Charlie. I can't claim that, unfortunately, but I do feel like we have the same artistic DNA. The way that I see it is your influences become part of who you are. So when I was about 13, 14 years old, I got a book about Maxfield Parrish. And this was just when I was starting to get really serious about art. And I would pore over those books, just staring at them and trying to copy from them. And Charlie did the same thing. He was really excited by Maxfield Parrish's color palettes, which you can see here in this painting with the bright oranges and the deep blues, and here with this purple background and then sort of this yellowy greenish foreground. So once I saw that, I'm like, oh, this is just the coolest thing ever, that we're kind of similar in that way. I have something in common with him. So once the all of my references are gathered, all of the characters are kind of nailed down, then I go on to storyboarding or laying out the pages. So I begin by making these really rough thumbnail sketches in my sketchbook that I don't think anybody but me can read. In about a year, I'll forget what these are. Also, I only remember now, just because, you know, I can tell now because of what I remember from that time. But of course, these aren't really readable, and I can't give these to the editor and the art director. So I made some a little more fleshed out, and that's what you see here. These were just digital sketches drawn on the computer, trying to give sort of the layout of what the pages would be, kind of the foreground, middle ground, background, sort of the sense of the layout. And down here, I've got the idiot-proof picture book dummy. If you're interested in making your own picture book, I was lucky that Angela Gier, I hope that's how you say her last name. I've never spoken to her in a way that, you know, I would know what her last name is, but she laid out the pages for me, so I didn't have to worry about it. And that's called pagination. So once I had the pagination, I just printed it out and drew on top of it. I went through very many different revisions for all of these pages. So some of them are in a funky color. This is a coal erase pencil, you know, that I drew these in, and these I redrew and redrew and redrew. And every time I would redraw it on my light board, I would change the color of the pencil. So I knew what I still had yet to draw and what changes I could make while I was drawing on top of it. So some of these are in a colored pencil and some are not. Of course, there's lots of revisions all the way throughout the process. There's, for instance, this title page. I started out with this fox kind of that I sort of seeded all the way throughout the book. And then I thought, well, what's the copyright page now? Could be the title page. And here's the deer that I was mentioning from earlier. But finally, we settled on the mushroom. Here's another example of how revisions shape the book. So when I was doing research, something I was really excited about and really interested in was the way that birch bark canoes are created. How they're, you know, the bark is stripped from the tree, how natural materials are used, roots and gum and everything just from the environment, how Native people have created these for hundreds of years without any, you know, modern tools or anything like that. And I wanted to put that in the book, but I only had a single page to do it on. So at first I was going to try and do something that I've seen in animation, where you take a character and they sort of split off into separate versions of themselves, all working on a project at the same time. But it doesn't work as well, I don't think, on a still image. I think it becomes cluttered and a little confusing. And also the editor, Nancy Kupal, and the marketing director, Jennifer McIntyre, we all sort of were talking about the different canoes we could come up with. There needed to be something that was a bit more rougher than this image here. So I drew about 10 of these different kind of canoes, and we came up with this one. And then the next step, no one has seen but me. This was just something for me to sort of figure out before I move on to the biggest, most labor intensive and scariest part of the process, which is the painting process. So I did what are called value studies. When you first go into art, you think, it's all about color, that color is what holds an image together. But it's really the value, the lightness or the darkness of a color that holds a picture together. And your focus is always on the lightest on the darkest, or the darkest on the lightest. So basically where there's highest contrast. And so I wanted to make sure that all of the pages would hang together when I added color. So I went through and digitally colored each of these little thumbnails to make sure that I knew exactly what should be what. And it was also a little bit of a way for me to procrastinate, just until I got my nerve up to paint. So then it was onto the painting stage. I used Holbein watercolors and gouache on Arch's watercolor paper. First, I traced the line art onto watercolor paper and stretched it so that it wouldn't warp. And then I went through all of the pages and painted all of the characters first. And once all of the characters looked consistent throughout, then I went through and painted the backgrounds. And I paid, a lot of attention to my reference images. For every picture, there's at least 20 or 30 reference images that I was looking at any one time. So that is the painting there. And then this image in particular, I stalled on for a while because in the story, this is Charlie beginning this painting here. And I wasn't sure that I could replicate it exactly. The reference image was a little small, so I couldn't see the brush strokes. I wasn't quite sure the order that he laid down the paint. And I was just a little intimidated about it. But once I read the manuscript and saw it's a work in progress. He's just starting the image. I thought, okay, I can do this. So I went ahead and just left some really loose washes in, and hopefully, it's completed through the viewer's imagination. This was another page that I really was interested in. This was actually the first page that I painted, sort of as a proof of concept. I loved the fact that Joe signed throughout the book, that Emily had placed that in there, that was part of him as a person, and it was part of him as a character in a picture book. And so I wanted to put that in the book. I wanted to have it more throughout the book, but it really worked just on this one page. So my idea was to do that thing again, where you sort of multiply parts of something, but it looked a little weird. So we went through a couple different revisions to find just the right style for it. And here he's saying to the gnomes, "What are you called?" And I know that because I was looking at Native American Sign Language. For instance, here's this symbol. And I also found some really cool videos that you can find online where it's a comparison between plain Indian Sign Language and American Sign Language. These are just some of the images to show how I used the reference images. Some of these you saw from Emily's slideshow, but like things like these rocks from this photograph, I thought, oh, wouldn't that be cool to put in there, and mist on the mountains, the gazebo, Charlie and his wife on the deck of the lodge. And then for some pages, I decided to go in a slightly different direction. All the advice I've received as an illustrator has been to always put a little piece of yourself in everything you do. And for me, a little piece of myself is the influences that I love so much. So I was really inspired by Charlie Russell. But when I went to go visit Glacier National Park and I was driving up the Going to the Sun Road, there was a part on the side of the mountain where the ground sort of does this undulating thing. And it reminded me of this John Bower painting. And John Bower was also an illustrator around the same time Charlie was, in Sweden, and he made these troll illustrations, which is something I've been in love with since I was a teenager. So I had to make a formula so I could add both things in. So I started with a Charlie Russell painting. Like I love the way that these dark trees frame this deer, and then there's this really deep, you know, moody forest in the back. And then I added that to this John Bauer painting with these funny little waves. And then I added that to the reference images, and that's how this image came to be. I did the same exact thing with this page. In particular, was N.C. Wyeth. This is one of my favorite paintings of all time by N.C. Wyeth. It's called The Giant. And then I added that to this beautiful Charlie Russell painting. And then, of course, looking at a reference of Kootenai and Salish people. And then that was this image here. And a lot of the photo sources that I use came from the Gilcrease Museum. They have an online database where you can find a lot of Charlie Russell photographs of his life and artwork and things like that. Of course, you saw this image that Emily had taken. And then I also utilized Google Maps because I live on the eastern side of Montana, and it takes me 10 hours to drive over to Glacier. Even though I went to Glacier and took about 600 photos for myself, I still needed more reference while I was painting. So I'm really lucky to live in the 21st century now, because you can just go on to Google Maps and say, okay, what's this place look like? And there's photographs that you can use for free just to, you know, make your composition. So I thought that was really cool. So this is just another image of Charlie on the porch. I wanted to make something that sort of had his stance. He always, in every single photo I looked at of him, he always seems to stand in the same way. He's always got his weight resting on one leg, and then the other leg's sort of loose, and he's kind of got this cocky, like, you know, slanted look to him. So I thought, you know, just seeing him like that sort of summed up his character. So that's pretty much it. I want to say thank you to Nancy Kupal, the editor, Jennifer McIntyre, the marketing director, Angela Gear, the book designer, Emily, of course, for writing the book, South Dakota Historical Society Press, South Dakota Festival of Books, the Humanities Council, and Jennifer Widman, the director of the South Dakota Center for the Book, and everybody who helped us put on this presentation today. And I think there's going to be a drawing demonstration here. Correct. Questions? Uh-oh. Hello?
Hi, Jeannie, we can see you now. I think
Okay.
the paper went away, the blank one,
Okay.
unless that wasn't right. But
Okay.
we're looking at you.
Okay. Okay, I wasn't sure. Are we doing questions now, or am I doing a drawing demonstration now and we'll take questions while I'm drawing? Is that?
Yeah, do you want to do that?
That'll work for me.
Okay.
Let me
Okay,
share
Jeannie's
screen
going to
again.
do a cool drawing for us. And does anybody have any questions that they want to put in the chat room? I could see them if you have any questions. I have a whole bunch of questions, but I'd like to see if anybody else has questions first. If not, okay, I think we might have one. Hold on. Okay. Emily, can you see the question, or should I read it to you? If you hit the chat at the bottom. And if not, I'll read it to you.
Yes, I can read it. I actually did not find Jeanne to illustrate my book. I was very lucky that the press found her for me and really found an illustrator that had such a great style and really made the book pop to life. And so I didn't know of her, and I'm just glad that they chose her.
Thank you.
Recommendations for other children's authors to find an illustrator. Jeannie, do you want to talk about how you were contacted or what you did to bring attention to yourself as an illustrator to places like South Dakota Historical Society?
So there's lots of different ways that an illustrator can be found. For the very first book that I illustrated, I actually created a postcard mailer and sent it to publishers. And then a publisher got in contact with me from that. In this case, for this book, I had my portfolio up on scbwi.org, which is the children's book or the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. If you're a member, you can host your portfolio there, and it's very easy for publishers and art directors to look through the different portfolios and find you from there. There's also, cold emailing. It used to be called cold calling, but now it's called, you just email people. But so that's some of the ways that you can be found by an art director. You can also be found online through social media as well.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I have a question. As I was looking at the paintings of Mr. Russell and your paintings, Jeannie, I thought about two things. One is, we have so many different paints now at our disposal. What did he have back then at his disposal? And did he have to take everything with him when he went to his cabin? Like all the different painting, the different colors or paint colors? Or was he able to make some of them? Or how did he do that? Do you have any ideas? What kind of paints were back then?
Well, he would order them from a catalog and order them from New York, I'm sure, or Chicago. And he'd often go to New York in the winter and of course, try and get commissions from different magazines and stay with friends there. And so I'm sure he'd also pick up supplies there. Paints, I'm pretty sure, are pretty easy to transport by bag. And I think they'd take the train at least as far as they could up to Belton and then get out and then go across a boat to the cabin. And so as for canvas, I'm sure he maybe brought a roll and stretched a little bit there. He probably pounded his own slate wood frames, but also, he would just take a lot of he had a few plein air kits. So if he just wanted to do color studies or drawings, they have these little plein air things that you could fold up in easels, and he could take hiking himself. So I think they were decently transportable for that aspect. But the major large canvases he usually would finish back in his studio in Great Falls.
Okay, and then I also noticed that his paintings have a tremendous amount of detail. I mean, tremendous amount of detail. So I was wondering, do we know at all how long it would take him to do one of those detailed paintings?
That's a good question. I'm not quite so sure, but I'm sure it took him maybe a month or so to finish. He'd be working on a few paintings at a time. Often he was a very physical person, so when he would get frustrated, he would turn to either sculpting, but often he had an easier time with doing stuff in the round. So like, let's say he was having trouble doing a deer in 2-dimensional, he'd sculpt it in 3D, then light it, and then practice drawing it. Or in order to get the sort of the kinks out of his system, he'd do some roping in his yard, just exercises to get his body movement and flowing. And but he would basically paint early in the morning, probably around like from 6 to noon, something like that. And then in the afternoon, he'd go hang out with his friends. So that's how he kind of set aside time for friends and then work.
Sounds like a great life. Sounds like he had a really great life. Does anybody else have any other questions? Jeannie, do you want to tell us anything about your drawing now?
So I'm just sort of sketching Charlie, just kind of a cartoon of him, I guess. This is sort of the rough drawing that I would start with when I was kind of laying him out on a page, just trying to get his sort of his basic shape and everything. So you start with like a skeleton or an armature underneath, and then from there you can build on top of it. it's just a matter of, doodling around, trying not to get sold on the lines. And it's kind of funny because I've only recently started doing digital art. So when I was doing this for the book, it was all traditional, with paper and pencil on a light board, which, if you want to make changes, it's a lot harder it's not harder, but it's more time intensive process, where this, Control Z is basically the best thing ever made. You just really quickly go back. So it's just one of those things where, when you draw, especially like thinking about Charlie, like how he didn't have those kind of tools when he was making art.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, he was doing it the really hard way. And it just, every time I work on this book, I was sort of thinking, I had the tools that I have, and I'm not sure that I could make the same kind of work that he did without the work. I mean, without the tools that I have these days. So I just thought that was kind of a really great testament to his skill and, his talent.
Yeah, I have to agree. What machine are you using now?
So right now I am working on a Surface Pro, and I'm using Photoshop, and I'm just using a sketchy pencil to sort of doodle the image.
Also, it's interesting about some of the you referenced in that drew you to adding for this Russell book. And I didn't mention him, but I don't know if you know of Arthur Rackham.
Yep.
Yeah, the Edwardian illustrator. It's funny because Josephine Trigg, his neighbor, they actually give books to Russell of Rackham, and he was one of their favorite illustrators. Look for with these sort of fairies and gnomes and kind of mythic creatures. So it's kind of funny how this source material, old is new again, and still inspiring to us today.
Yeah, that's what I really loved when I was reading about him, was just seeing how many things we have in common, just artistic taste wise. I was like, oh yeah, I love that guy too. And a lot of the artists that I really love were contemporaries of Charlie. I think for me, that's just sort of my favorite time period in illustration. All the really great artists were working then. Howard Pyle, or I think that's how you say his name, N.C. Wyeth, like you say, Rackham, and so many others were just all the Victorian fairy artists, which are something, that I always pull from. It was just a good time to be an illustrator. I think it was the golden age.
I was just going to say that, yeah, the golden age of illustration.
Yeah, beautiful. Jeannie, do you think your illustrations turn out the same with like the way you did this book and the way you're doing this now? Do you think they turn out the same?
No, I think part of the reason is the tool. Part of it is also time. So, as you keep drawing and making stuff, your style will change as you go through your creative life. And now about a year has elapsed since the book was finished. So my style has already started to change from the book. So I couldn't draw the same book now. It would be completely different. And so, just doing this drawing now, after just trying to remember what Charlie looked like how I used to draw him, I can't draw him the same anymore. He's the one in the book is that one, and now I've got something different.
Can you get the textures like the same when you're working with, watercolor paper compared to something like this?
So watercolor is kind of everybody always says it's a difficult medium, and it can be. It's sort of funny. It so much depends on the paper you use.
Right.
And with a digital medium, there are a lot of really great brushes being made that sort of copy what watercolor does, but it doesn't quite get it, just because the reaction between the paint and the paper does so much stuff just by itself that I don't think you can recreate it digitally. So if I were to paint the book again, I would still use watercolor.
Oh, that's good. That's what I was curious about too. Yeah, I have to agree. I've seen a lot of art done this way and the other way. And I think, the old fashioned way just adds a lot more texture and feelings, I think. You
Yeah,
agree with that?
I think digital art can definitely have the same sort of, nuance and depth to it that traditional painting can. I think it's just a matter of, there's some artists even that can fool you to think that it's all watercolor. It's a digital watercolor instead of a true watercolor, but there's just something about watercolor itself, especially when you see it in person. It just seems to have a life of its own that's hard to recreate on, especially like something I found that was difficult was making the paintings and then scanning them into the computer and trying to edit them on the computer. It's always frustrating because they don't look right on the computer.
I agree.
So,
I agree.
yeah.
Well, I think our time is up. If you're there, Carolyn, I think our time is up. So I think we've just a couple of minutes, right, Carolyn?
Yep, we should wrap up so that they can get in for the next event. Yep.
Okay, so on behalf of the South Dakota Humanities Council, I'd like to thank Emily and Jeannie today for this wonderful presentation and everybody who joined us. Thank you, everyone, and this was great. I really, truly enjoyed it, and I learned so much. Thank you, ladies.
Thank you. It was so nice to do this.
It really was, and thank you for drawing for us as well, and all the history behind everything, which I had no idea. Thank you so much.
Thank
Have a
you.
great day.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.